Life podcast. Today we are in part 3 of our Hall of Faith series, just looking at what that has to say about faith and how that applies to our lives as Christians today.
So our question for this week is, would you rather shovel snow or rake leaves? And why?
Easy. Rake leaves.
And why?
Well, for one, snow is very heavy and I am weak. But also, I just don't like the cold. So I feel like fall, not that fall is not cold, but it's warmer than winter. And then leaves are just fun and pretty, where snow just is blah.
No, snow is pretty. It sparkles.
From a distance in my house.
Now, I would rather shovel snow because leaves it's a never-ending battle. Like, you can shovel snow and it will be gone. Like, it's not coming back most of the time.
I was going to say.
Leaves, every time. You'll rake them in a pile, and they'll poof, be gone. Like, they're no longer in a pile anymore. They're just everywhere. So, I would rather shovel snow. I would agree that doing it in the winter, is tough because it is so cold, but I think I would still take it over raking leaves. I would rather just let my leaves lay on the ground.
Yeah. If you get lucky, they might just blow away on their own.
Yeah, like...
Go to the neighbor's yard.
Just take a leaf blower. Blow them out of your yard. So, tell us what you think. If you would rather rake leaves or shovel snow, tell us why. That's the most important part.
Yeah.
So we're part 3 of this series. We went through Abel and Enoch. We went through Noah. We went through a part of Abraham's story and Sarah. And then he kind of ropes just some random, he doesn't name them by name, but just people of the day were looking forward to God's promises and putting their faith in him, that he would carry it out even after death. And we're going to kind of talk about that too, with these people that we talk about as well, because what we're going to find out is this writer of Hebrews is really pushing us towards a direction about God fulfilling his promises. Always, like even when we don't think it's going to happen, God still's faithful. God still keeps his promises even after death, right? Because he's outside of time and space and those things. God's not limited by the time frame that we are. He can fulfill his promises before we are alive and after we are alive here on this earth. But so we're gonna look at Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. We're going to look at Joseph, and just kind of their stories and how they made it into this Hall of Faith.
Mm-hmm. So we did talk about Abraham last time. So it's interesting because you kind of get here's this first glimpse and then a second glimpse. But like you said, we're hitting on multiple individuals and kind of like this little family moment of faith. But we're going to jump in at verse 17. It says, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promises, and yet he was offering his one and only son, the one to whom it had been said, 'Your offspring will be traced through Isaac.' He considered God to be able even to raise someone from the dead. Therefore he received him back, figuratively speaking." So when we look at this section, I feel like there's definitely similarities between the first time we're reading about Abraham in the Hall of Faith, but there's also some differences. And with this one, it's referencing to the story in Genesis 22 of Abraham and Isaac, and I feel like that's a story that a lot of people know. You hear about it. Even in the children's church classes we were teaching, this is a story you hit on where God calls Abraham to essentially sacrifice Isaac, and he just says, grab this stuff, go to this place, you're going to go up this mountain, and you're going to sacrifice your son. Which sounds confusing because you're like, well, didn't God say that you're going to have all these descendants, and this is your one and only son, who these descendants are supposed to come from? Wait a second. But it's interesting to see that in this moment, Abraham doesn't really hesitate, which is hard to relate to, because I feel like if it were like, if I were in that situation, I'd be like, I'm not sacrificing my child. But Abraham gathers up the stuff. He goes up the mountain, and he's all the way to the point where like he's got Isaac on the altar, and then we see the angel of the Lord comes in and stops him, and we end up seeing that like this moment where a lamb is provided, but you see just Abraham's obedience in that moment of he was going to do it. Like if that's what God wanted, he had faith that God's plan was bigger and that things would still come to be with as they were promised. But it's a really cool moment of faith, and just like a moment that you see how much he's willing to sacrifice because of how much he trusts God.
Yeah. This is one of my, I think when we talk about faith, this is one of the things that normally get brought up because it's so evident. For one, you read it and it, like you just see this testing of Abraham's faith. And in Genesis 22, verse 1, it says, sometime later, God tested Abraham and he said, Abraham, and then here I am, he replied. And God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him as a burnt offering on the mountain I will show you. There's something that I think is significant, and this is towards the end when God comes to him through the angel and is basically like, stop, like I see your faithfulness. I'm going to provide a substitute for Isaac. There's another, he says the same thing Abraham does. He says, here I am. Right? That was Abraham's characteristic when it comes to his faith in the Lord. He was always ready to say, here I am. When the Lord would speak or call out to him, he was always ready to be like, I'm right here. Like, what do you want? He was very obedient and faith driven in his walk. But what this shows us, I think, is that there's going to be moments of testing in our faith, right? God is going to, at times, in a sense, have us prove our faith, and it looks different for everybody. Nobody's going to get tested the same way as somebody else. It's never going to be the same because our testings of faith are going to be just very different. But this shows just really profound, like you're saying, because in my head and in my flesh, I would be like, there's no way, like, Lord, you promised that I'm gonna have this, like you must be making a mistake, right? Or maybe I'm hearing you wrong. But Abraham doesn't do that, right? He gathers up, and you see a sense that there was a sense of sadness while all of this is happening. But here, what we see in Hebrews, which I think is significant to the whole story. This is why I think the Bible is such an amazing piece, is that it gives us some insights even from the New Testament, showing us looking back to the Old Testament, where it says that Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. What I find this to be really awesome, because Abraham had no evidence that God could raise the dead.
He had never seen that happen.
Nobody had been, God raised this person from the dead, yesterday. Like, that didn't happen. It never happened.
Yeah, it wasn't like he had the miracles of the New Testament to be like, well, this Jesus guy was raising people from the dead.
And Abraham, looking back at what God had promised him, I think Abraham realized that even if he went through with it and killed Isaac and sacrificed him, that God would raise him from the dead. And I really think that is what Hebrews is sharing with us, is that he reasoned, meaning he thought about it, right? It wasn't like a maybe. Like he in his mind, he processed evidence that God is the Almighty, and that God is the God who's created the universe, who's breathed breath into man, life into man. And in that, he reasoned that if the God can do all that, he could for sure raise my son from the dead. And I think that highlights that even Abraham understood that even when something seems uncertain or impossible, that God can still bring it out and God can still make it happen, right? That's a sign of genuine faith, that you can be looking down the barrel of the impossible, like there's just something that has never happened before, and God can do it because God has the ability to do it. And I think this shows us that This is why he really is the father of faith, right? He's looking throughout the Old Testament, even in the New Testament. Abraham is always pointed as the guy of faith, right? He's the father, right? Because of these moments in the book of Genesis is where Abraham was willing to give up the things he loved, the things he desired, the things he wanted, to say, "Here I am, Lord," right? I'm for you. Like I'm gonna be obedient to you. I'm gonna go after you, and I think that shows just how amazing Abraham's faith is.
Yeah, like you were saying, I feel like it's such a good example for us today of just being reassured that even when we're in these moments where, like, I feel like so often you're in these moments where you don't know what's going to happen next, and you're like, okay, well, there's 600 options of what might happen, and most of them aren't good. Like, how's this going to pan out? It really reminds you that, like, God has it all under control, and, like, he is going to be faithful to keep his promises. And if you just give it to him, put your faith in him, the outcome is going to be okay. No matter, like, what it is, even when you can't see it, what's going to happen.
And this is important for our faith because it at least gives us a picture that, okay, there's times where we're going to be tested. There's times where things are going to feel uncertain or even sometimes contradictory, right? Remember, Abraham was promised that through Isaac, nations, just numerous, and sands on the seashore, and blessed, and all sorts of stuff. And then now God seemingly is giving him a contradictory statement of, no, I want you to sacrifice your son to me. But because Abraham knew God's nature, because he knew God's faithfulness, those things, that it really, the hope of the resurrection of Isaac was enough to keep him going, right? So that he would persevere through obedience and faith in his life. And this should be the same way in our life, is that when faith seems uncertain or even contradictory in our life, where we can still put our hope in the Lord, still put our trust in him, knowing his character and his nature, that God will bring whatever he's promised to fruition, and things will be okay, and we don't have to worry or be troubled by whatever God's commanding us to do, because we know that he's not going to lead us somewhere that's going to be death or destruction or those things, because God doesn't lead anybody there. And I think that's a cool part of this story is just that last part with the resurrection and he reason that God could raise Isaac from the dead. And this should be like our hope, is that in life things may get difficult and tough, but we have the hope of the resurrection. Like, we put our faith in the resurrection, that really nothing can harm us, nothing can destroy us when our faith is in that, right, in the resurrection, that God can raise us from the dead, right? If that wasn't a thing, then we don't really have hope. We don't have assurance, and really our faith is not very deep, because ultimately it's, well, there's nothing after, right? There's no hope of being raised from the dead or anything like that. So it doesn't produce perseverance or endurance, because there's nothing to persevere towards or endure for, because you have no hope. But here, because we know God raises the dead, God has the power to do that, and through Jesus Christ we're promised the resurrection, then we have perseverance and endurance, or we should. That should be a character trait of your faith, perseverance and endurance. And that's what we see in Abraham's story. That, like, this, we're not talking about a short moment. Like, there was a journey to get to the mountain, and
lots of time to ponder everything.
And I always wonder, because we don't get any insight from it, but like, Isaac's not a baby, like he's a child.
Yeah, so what?
He's not a baby. He's like, what on earth is happening?
Yeah.
But then what we get in next is this, just the story of Isaac.
Yeah. So obviously Isaac doesn't get sacrificed. And so the story continues, and verse 20 says, "By faith Isaac bless Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. And so this is referencing Genesis 27. So we see like through this moment that Abraham's faith is really continuing through his son Isaac. And at this point, Isaac has his own sons. And Jacob and Esau, I feel like, again, it's just one of those stories that you hear time and time again. And there's that moment where he's going to give blessings, and we see Jacob comes in and like tricks Isaac and pretends to be Esau to get the better blessing. But through this, like, despite the deception, we see how we see Isaac's faith, because he recognizes like what God's will is in that moment, and he still blesses Jacob, trusting that God's will and plan is bigger and then maybe what Isaac like wants to do like internally. Because Esau, he's like, okay, I'm gonna give Esau these better things, but God's like, no, this needs to go to Jacob. So I think that's just a really cool moment where we see the faith continue throughout this family, and we'll continue to see it carry out throughout this family and these family members.
So yeah, Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, even though the story's it doesn't go in a good direction for Esau, but there's still blessings there, and that's important to know, that even though there was promised struggles in Esau's story, but there was also blessings there as well. And we all have free will, we all have a choice, but we also serve the God who is sovereign and knows all things as well. But yeah, like you said, the story of Isaac is interesting because we don't have a lot of information really about Isaac's life, except for these moments with his sons. And I think this is important because this happened a lot throughout the Old Testament. It's almost as like a passing down of your faith, in some sense, right? There's promised blessings and an inheritance and things like that, but those only came from the one who knew the Lord and trusted in Him. And that's what you see with Isaac's. Really, just the simple act of blessing his children was an act of faith, because Isaac is relying on God to fulfill his promises, because he's not seeing it happen, right? Isaac's not in the promised land. He's not. Yeah. He doesn't see the numerous children and descendants as numerous as the sands on the seashore. Like, he can probably count them on his hands at this point. Like, there's not that many.
Yeah.
But yet he's almost as he's giving that promise to his children, right? You're part of this. You're part of this promise. And I think that's at least can show us that there's almost like a legacy of faith that we leave to our children. And we should think about it that way, is that we should be teaching them the things of the Lord in such a way that they put their faith in the Lord, right? We shouldn't be leading them in a way that now it's a struggle for them to rely on the promises of God. No, if you're a believer and you're constantly reminding your children of the promises, you're constantly showing them the things the Lord has done in your life, they're more likely. Again, we see two different people, so I'm not saying that this is a foolproof plan, but I'm saying that the likelihood that your children will come up after you in the faith is higher when you're talking about the Lord, sharing about who He is, sharing about His character, sharing that He's promised you these things and that they're part of it. They're more likely to be a part of it. But that's really all we really understand. I mean, there's more to it because we're going to talk about his sons that I think Isaac is a part of.
Yeah.
But like Jacob here is I think like is important because Jacob he gets another name, Israel. It's part of his whole story. But like you said, Jacob does this thing where he not only does he deceive Isaac when he pretends to be, but before that he deceives his brother. Like, Jacob's not a good guy. Like, by any stretch of the word, he's not a good guy, right? His name means deceiver, right? Because that's what he does. Like, he deceived his brother, he deceived his father, and then he took off because he's afraid that he's going to get hurt, by his brother. His brother's going to kill him. And so you almost see really, I don't want to say he didn't leave the faith, but he runs from really where he probably should have never done it. Right? He takes off, but God has a plan.
Yeah.
God has a purpose for all these things. And he goes to basically he gets to a point through his journey without going through every single thing with the two women and the father. Also, he was a deceiver. Now he's being deceived by the father. It's a whole mess of a story,
Yeah.
which shows us that families are messy in general. But he gets to this point where he almost switches. Right? He doesn't seem like Jacob the deceiver anymore. Now he's Israel. Right? He's the person after the Lord. He's the person who wrestled with God for a blessing in his life. He's the one who seems now to be putting his full trust in the Lord through the journey. And I think that is the least inspiring for us to know that even in the lapse of our faith, right, God is still working for our good, and God's still longing for us to come back to him. And I think that's what we see with the story of Jacob, and just basically his actions in the beginning really maybe at most a surface level of faith, but then towards the end we see like a deep commitment of his faith, and just really amazing that he wrestles with the Lord. Like that's the most significant thing really that happens in all of it. And then you have the 12 sons and things like that as well. There's a whole lot of stuff that goes on in that story for sure.
Yeah, and I think that's where verse 21 picks up, is more towards, it picks up really at the end of Jacob's life, where verse 21 says, by faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph, and he worshipped leaning on the top of his staff. And really, I mean, that's like, it's highlighting this part in Genesis 48 and even some into 49, where, I mean, he's like, even the verse says he's older, he's close to death, but he ends up, when he's in this moment of being close to death, he's visited by his son Joseph, and then Joseph's two sons, we see Manasseh and Ephraim. I'm like, let me see if I can say that right. And when they arrive, Jacob recounts the promises that God's made the family. So you see that where, like you were saying with Isaac, that those family legacies and him hearing the promises, again, he hasn't seen all this come to be, but he still trusts that God's going to do it. So he's passing on, kind of like recounting what God's promised so that they know. But he also accepts Joseph's two sons as his own to make them part of these 12 tribes of Israel. But I think the cool part, and we see it emphasized here in Hebrews 11, is it talks about how he worshipped leaning at the top of his staff. And I think that just shows us so much about how, like, our faith can produce this attitude of worship. So it's like, Jacob, again, he's not seeing the promise come to be. He's maybe seeing small glimpses of it, but again, he's not to the promised land. He's not seeing as many family members. He's seeing more than Isaac, but he's still trusting that God is going to keep this promise. And so even in these final moments, he's got this attitude of worship, and he's wanting to worship the Lord. And so I think even for us today, like, we're going to be faced with uncertainty. We're going to be faced with like death at some point. But having faith in these moments that God is faithful to what he's promised us, hopefully will produce in us an attitude of worship.
And that's exactly right. Faith should produce worship, because you're recognizing that I'm dependent upon the Lord. And not only am I dependent upon the Lord, but the Lord is faithful and able to fulfill his promises and to fulfill our needs. And I think Jacob understood that more and more throughout his journey in life, which really shows us that faith is a lifelong commitment to the Lord. It's not something that you have for a moment and you set it down for a while, and then when you need it, you pick it back up. No, this is something that it's a lifelong commitment that produces worship to the Lord. So the reason why I say that is because if you're a person that just decides, oh, I'm going to use my faith today and I'm going to set it down tomorrow, then you're not going to be worshiping the God. You're not going to be worshiping the Lord as He deserves, you're not going to get to experience the blessings for it. And then when we see that it says that He blessed each of Joseph's sons, which we're going to get into that. Jacob got not only to see his sons born, but also the sons of his sons, right? His grandchildren. And he got to bless them, which is a blessing to get to do that. So not only as a father blesses his sons, but even grandparents play a part in it, right? Grandparents play a part in leaving a legacy of faith, right? Then that should, if you're old and you feel like, well, I don't have a say anymore, you do, right? Even if they don't listen to you, it doesn't matter, right? You have an opportunity to leave a legacy of faith for your grandchildren, just as Jacob does here. A moment to bless them, a moment to bless them with who the Lord is and what the Lord's done, and reminding them of the promises of God. Like, that's inspiring, or at least it's a blessing to get to do that. As simple as that, right? It's a blessing to get to share with generations about what God is doing, not only because we should do that, but because it inspires the next generation and next generations to keep the faith, right? To not backslide, to not turn away, but to rely on the God who's been there for my grandpa and my father, and I know He's going to be there for me as well. That's really awesome to see, for sure.
Well, and I think, like you were saying too, we see that like faith should be a lifelong thing. But I also think with Jacob's story, just hearing you go through just even everything that's happening before this moment that this verse is referencing, I think it reminds us too that it's never too late to put your faith in the Lord. Even if you feel like you've messed up too much, like Jacob didn't do great things. Like he messed up, but he knew that he could come back to the Lord. And so I think that's something to remember, that it's never too late to put your faith in the Lord, and just to really see what blessings can come from that.
Yeah, and what we're about to find out with the story of Joseph, that those that are persistent in leaving a legacy of faith see their children, not all their children, some do backslide. Again, it's not every time. Everyone has free will, they can make their own choice. But Jacob got to see one of his sons save the rest of his sons. And I think that's significant, because that just shows the power of God in our life that faith produces, right? Those that put their trust in the Lord, God does great things with, and God is going to do great things with. Here we see Joseph as well. It says in verse 22, it says, by faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. See, Joseph here, it's just showing us the tail end of his story. But we know that Joseph had a huge test of faith, because his brothers decided to throw him in a pit, and then decide, well, now we're just going to sell him into slavery. And so they sold him into slavery.
And then it didn't get any better.
And then it never got any better. And he gets falsely accused, thrown in prison, and a bunch of other stuff. And then he makes his way to Egypt, and now he becomes second in command of Egypt, which is crazy, because it shows us that God can take us through some really bumpy roads, but we make it out on the other side. Those that persist in their faith, that continue to believe that the Lord is powerful, continue to put their obedience in the Lord, and see the Lord do amazing things, right? Joseph maintained his trust in the Lord. And we should maintain our trust in the Lord, even if things get chaotic and they don't make sense, or just bad things happen in our life. We should still maintain our faith, because we know that the Lord, Joseph knew the Lord wasn't causing this to happen, but He was going to bring good about from it. And that should be at least encouraging for us to know that no matter what bad thing we're going through, if we're still putting our faith in the Lord, then He'll bring good about from it. And that we that's something that we can put our faith behind in moments of trials and tribulations and sufferings and pains in our life, knowing that God's going to bring good about from this. Maybe it's something um, that affects us, or maybe it's good in such a way that it affects other people. Just really like, Joseph kind of experienced both of these for sure, with his ability to forgive his brothers for doing all of it, and being their salvation in a sense, because there was a famine going on, and they there was no place that had food, but through God's providence and God's vision to Joseph, he was able to prepare Egypt in such a way that it took care of the Israelites. So I think that's important. But what's really being described here at the last tail end of Hebrews is Joseph gives a moment for the Israelites when he gets close to his death, that basically God was going to deliver them, God was going to rescue them, and that basically that he wanted to. He's like, take my bones with you, right? I don't want to be buried in Egypt. Like I want to experience the promise. In essence, that's what he's saying, right? I want to go with you to the promised land. And what we find out towards the end of Moses, or end of Deuteronomy into Joshua, they took his bones, and he, in some aspects, went with them to the promised land and saw, or experienced some level, however that looks. I'm not really for sure, part of that promise for sure. But Genesis 50:20, 24, it says, Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up from out of this land he has promised an oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now here's the significant part about all this. Some might say, well, that's going to happen in a couple weeks. It didn't happen in a couple weeks. It took 400 years before that promise happened. But the promise still happened, right? Sometimes we think that God has to fulfill his promises in a moment. God doesn't have to do that. But God will fulfill his promises, even if they take longer than what we want or expect, because God sees the whole picture. God sees everything, not just our need for the promise to be fulfilled, but for future generations in the world for this promise to be fulfilled. God knows the exact timing when to bring out his promises, right? We're promised the resurrection. Well, that promise has been a promise for 2,000 years, but it makes the promise no less true. Same thing with the story of Joseph. The prophecy that Joseph gave to his brothers was no less true because it took longer than maybe they would have expected. Right? They went through trials and tough times. But God fulfilled his promise to his people. And that's the same thing for us.
Well, that's what I really like about this verse is, like, when you're reading the verse in Hebrews 11, at first it's easy to almost feel like it's kind of like this, like, insignificant moment, because you're just like, okay, so he gave them directions on how to bury him. Okay, how does that show faith? But like you were saying, it just shows that, like, he had so much faith in this promise that he has been hearing, that he wanted to still be a part of it. He trusted that, like, so much so in this promise, that God was going to take them to this promised land, and that they were going to leave Egypt, and he wanted to be with the people when they went. And I think for us today, it just shows us that, like, we should live in a way where our actions, our decisions, the things we say reflect how much we trust in the Lord with things that we don't know yet. Like you said, the Lord's going to promise us things, and sometimes it takes years to actually see that happen. There could be instances where you may not see it happen, like we see with Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. But, like, living in a way, or like saying things that just show your faith, I think just speaks volumes. Because here, like, Joseph didn't see it happen, but his directions of, this is what I want you to do, spoke volumes to his faith.
Yeah, and his his words and his actions inspired people to stay faithful, even in a time of uncertainty, in a time of despair and slavery. People didn't forget about God. You know, were there probably lapses in faith? Of course. Just like we've already seen through all these people's lives.
Yeah.
We're not perfect, but hopefully we can always go back to God's promise. And that should be enough for us to keep persevering and to keep enduring in this life, knowing that God will bring about his promises, right? That's what we've learned so far, really, throughout most of the stories. These people in this Hall of Faith, is that they continued to look to the promises of God. And maybe you're here and you're thinking, you know, I need more faith, or how much faith do I really have, or whatever that may look like. Then the question that I would ask is, are you looking at the promises of God? Are you relying on the promises of God? Are you letting the promises of God fuel your faith? Because if you're not, yeah, you're probably going to find yourselves in low moments, in times where you may think, "Oh, is this ever going to happen?" Or, am I ever going to get out of this situation? But if you're looking at the promises of God, then no matter what situation you're in, you're going to find yourself in peace and comfort, because that's what having faith in the Lord produces in our life: peace and comfort, perseverance and endurance. These things that we've talked about throughout all these people's lives. That's what made them people of faith. Those that where they found themselves in this Hall of Faith is because they were people that looked to the promises of God and allowed those promises to fill their perseverance, to fill their endurance, to fill their peace, to fill their comfort in their life. That's how they were able to make it through those tough. I can imagine living in the desert and being slaves for 400 years, right? There's going to be a lot of sense of despair and a lot of sense of depression and a sense of I don't even know what the word is, I forget, but it's never going to happen, right? It's never going to come about. What's the point?
Yeah.
But though they may have had times where they may have thought that for a moment, we get a good sense that they never forgot about God. They never forgot about who God is and what he can do. So that should be that. Let that fuel you. Let the character of God and the nature of God and how God is faithful and he fulfills his promises keep you going, right? Keep you going. We're going to see that too with Moses and some of these other people that we're going to look at too next week and kind of finish it up. Because Moses, he has a crazy journey as well. And then the list of a bunch of people that he throws in at the end.
Yeah.
We'll kind of just briefly talk about. But you have any final thoughts?
I just think getting to look at this moment, like I said, you get this little family tree moment for a second, and we talked about it throughout this whole episode, just the importance of how our faith can to leave a legacy for our families. And I think that's one of those things where it's so easy to, at least in the situation with my family, of wanting to live in a way where my faith is shown to my family around me. But also I think it does make me start to think, okay, there is so much value too in living with a faith that hopefully our children will be inspired by, and then they can carry that on to their children and just start this new chain of believers, especially knowing that I didn't grow up in that. So I feel like it shows more of this encouraging moment of my faith is not just about myself, but it has an impact that's lasting for a family.
Yeah, absolutely. So that concludes our episode, part 3 of this Hall of Faith series. We have one more to go to finish it up, and then who knows what we do after that. Share what you want us to do next for a series or whatever topic you want us to talk about. Maybe it's a specific Bible verse or part in the Bible. We would love to do something like that as well. Share with us if you'd rather be raking leaves or shoveling snow, and then we'll give you a call up when we need you to do that. Yeah. So thank you for subscribing. Thank you for liking this video. Again, share it with somebody. And as always, thank you for listening to the New Life Podcast.